Okay, so the last two courses or two classes, we've been talking about stationary sources. So today we'll be talking about transportation technologies and the related fuel use, energy, and infrastructure implications. We'll quickly pick off where we left off last time, though. Finishing up with looking at the environmental impacts. So these are specifically for a lot of the renewable sources that we had talked about last time. So externalities for solar energy uses quite a bit of land. So deploying the solar panels in terms of footprint per sort of amount of energy produced, this is going to be much larger than most other energy sources. So you need about a square kilometer for anywhere between 20 to 60 megawatts, depending on the capacity factor of your solar panels. CSP, so this is the one that actually uses the steam turbine by concentrating solar power into a single point to boil water. So this requires a lot of cooling water, which can be fairly scarce in desert areas. In terms of materials, there's some energy required for manufacturing and installation, and it actually uses a little bit of hazardous materials. So this can include arsenic, cadmium, and even silicon can technically be hazardous. Okay, for wind, three main environmental concerns are visual impact. And so this relates back to this issue of NIMBYism, as well as noise, and then risk of bird collision and wildlife disruption. Although I will say for the sort of last one, this is like a common point that some folks will talk about, like bird impacts with wind turbines. And it definitely is a thing, although in comparison to sort of other energy sources, it can be sort of not as bad. And so actually there are a lot of wildlife death associated with other means of power production as well. And siting can greatly reduce a lot of these issues, or help mitigate a lot of these issues. Environmental impacts and externalities of hydropower. So there are always issues with damming sort of reservoirs and bodies of water, especially on fish and wildlife that relies on fish. And then issues related to flooding. And so the cyclical nature of releasing water can inundate environmental areas, and even man-made like cities and towns. If folks recall, a couple of years ago, issues with the bypass at the Oroville Dam caused a lot of concern for actually a fairly large population center. So these things are potentially dangerous, although the frequency with which this happens is fairly low. Okay, great. So that rounds out the environmental impacts. If anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, we'll move on to transportation. So we'll first start with fossil fuel-based transport. And the primary fuel of use here is petroleum. So thinking a little bit about some of the economics, crude oil from which gasoline and other fossil fuels in transportation are derived, such as diesel, are sort of very closely correlated. And there is volatility related to the economy, and also having to do with sort of decision making on producers in sort of price setting. It has, over the last decade, has been somewhat steady, although pretty recently oil and gas prices have gone up quite a bit for folks who have experienced that pain at the pump. Extraction, so traditional sorts of oil extraction. Folks may have seen these sort of oil derricks if you've ever driven from like NorCal to SoCal, or if you've ever driven through Texas, you may have seen these. This is a sort of technology, and an actually fairly old technology that is able to essentially bring up oil after you sort of drill down into oil-bearing zones. So that type of oil extraction is known as conventional. It's typically sort of the highest quality and lightest oil. And so when we talk about lightest oil, we'll see what this means in a little bit, but generally that means you have sort of better derivatives for transport fuels such as gasoline and diesel. Unconventional oils are a lot heavier, which means the carbon chains within these oils are a lot longer and often tar-like. A lot more difficult to recover since the production and refinements of these resources requires a lot more money inputs. And so for that reason, the vast majority of the current oil production is conventional oil. So this is a liquid fuel supply curve. This is a fairly important sort of curve to understand. So let's sort of walk through this. So the first on the x-axis refers to the cumulative production of liquid fuel. So this is the total amount that you could get out of the total available sort of resources. So if we consumed all of the oil on Earth, that would be on the order of, say, 20 thousand gigabarrels of oil. And this sort of has this dimension of moving up, and these represent essentially different types of oils. The reason why it moves up is on the y-axis. Different types of oil costs more money to produce. And so you've got conventional oil here. This EOR stands for enhanced oil recovery. You've got tar sands and heavy oil. And then you've got synfuels, which would be sort of artificial creation of fuels. You can go from gas to liquid, or you can go from coal to liquid. So what you see here is that we prefer to use up the lowest cost production first. And as you use all of this up, then you start diving into other more expensive means of production. So after about, say, 1,500 gigabarrels of conventional oil, you would have to then start relying on enhanced oil recovery and so on and so forth. What you can see in the dark green versus the light green represents reserves versus resources. So reserves are known quantities that we're able to sort of feasibly obtain. And then the light green are resources that we know exist, but I guess wouldn't be strictly economical to extract. And so you can see in comparison to what has already been consumed, which is sort of this green shaded area here, what's left in terms of extraction. Okay, so the next concept I wanted to discuss is this idea of peak oil. So for folks who may have heard of this, this concept, so this is defined as the point where the production of oil peaks. So typically we consider this to be at around 50% of when reserves have been produced. So as we can see from the previous chart, right, as you produce more oil, it gets more and more expensive because essentially the easy stuff has already been extracted. And so if you think about this conceptually, that means that the latter 50% will always be sort of more expensive and more difficult to extract. And as a result, you tend to have this issue where, okay, your production rate should, in theory, sort of fall off after that peak. And so this is based off of our understanding, right, that oil is a finite resource, and at some future date, oil production will reach, will peak, and production will decline. So this is a fairly old chart here where we're kind of showing the way in which we determine that peak oil has happened is essentially by looking at production and whether or not it's following sort of an upward trend or a downward trend. And so there's this idea that oil production actually peaked in the United States in 1970s, and obviously the peak for worldwide production would be slightly different. And so many years ago, I think back in the sort of early 2000s, this figure was put together. But one of the things to remember, however, is that reserve resources can actually change over time based off of improvements in technology that may turn potential resources into what we would consider as reserves. And so this is actually exactly what happened in the US. So we can see that sort of following this decline in production, all of a sudden there was sort of this large increase again. And that sort of follows in the same vein where new technologies that enabled us to tap into known resources and therefore reserves. So this is referring to shale oil. Remember, I was talking about hydraulic fracking before. This also allows us to get oil as one of the sort of outputs, not just natural gas, and as a result, increased US production quite substantially. It actually turns US into a net exporter of oil as opposed to a net importer of oil. We can see the sort of proportion coming from hydraulic fracking. This is oil production in the US from 2000 to 2015, right? So hydraulically fractured wells account for sort of over half of the oil production by the mid-2010s. As I was mentioning in terms of the economics, it actually follows along with a lot of price shocks and volatility in the prices of oil falls in line with recessions. And so you can see how that sort of lines up in this figure here. Okay, and so one of the things to think about in terms of sustainability is how can issues related to conservation postpone peak oil. You can imagine that this sort of question is particularly important for a lot of folks in the oil industry. This directly affects a lot of their sort of bottom line. Oh, I see a question. Go ahead.
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
Where you relate the shocks to oil price shocks and recessions. So what's that? Can you explain that a little bit more? Do oil price rises determine recessions, or?
Yeah, okay. So the price shocks are kind of seen in red here. There's some kind of strict definition of when we consider this to be a price shock. So you can see times when it's happening. And I guess typically the argument is that following a recession, which is each of these sort of gray bars, you typically tend to see a decline, a sort of rapid decline in oil prices. So that's something like this.
But does it go the other way too? That the rise in oil causes recession? Because it almost looks like
yeah,
it coincides.
Yeah, I guess that's possible as well. I don't know if there's been sort of as much sort of direct sort of correlation of that. But there have been studies that sort of indicate it's been a while since I've looked at these, but I guess the argument is that like as economic activity decreases, that puts sort of downward pressure on sort of general mobility use. So both personal and for freight. It's not always the case that happens, and actually the pandemic is a good example of kind of the opposite. But generally, sort of downward pressure on the demand side ends up leading to so lowering of oil prices.
That makes sense. Would that last year be? Do you know what the last year is?
Oh, right here.
Would that like be close to 2008?
Yeah, it's getting close, but the 2008 one, actually, let me go back because I think I had that in one of the earlier slides. Yeah, so 2008, you see this happen, right? So same type of thing right after the Great Recession. There's a plunge in the oil price.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So let me jump back over here. Okay, so thinking back to this and actually the sort of macro long-term effect of conservation will also have, obviously some kind of long-term impact on oil prices. We can imagine this world, hypothetically, where everyone transitions to an electric car. Think about what that would do in terms of price of oil, right? Where you have, we currently have in place a huge amount of infrastructure to provide this sort of vast supply of oil based on the demand in transport and other uses. And if that sort of goes away, that would ostensibly sort of crash the price of oil. So things that are leading to those trends, so a lot of fuel efficiency improvements, renewable fuel standards. So people have attempted to sort of understand how demand will change in the future as a result of a lot of these policies. It's actually funny. This plot is actually a fairly old projection, and they have like fuel cell vehicles, but they don't have electric vehicles, which is definitely making a much sort of larger impact, we can say with greater certainty today, than fuel cell vehicles. Okay, so coronavirus disruption. So this was sort of right at the beginning of 2020, and oil prices have since rebounded quite a bit, actually to be sort of historic highs right now. But during the pandemic, during the year 2020, there was a substantial lull in demand for sort of obvious reasons. But sort of following that period, 2020, 2021, while sort of passenger travel has not quite sort of reached 2019 levels, freight demand has actually gone up to be quite a bit higher. And a lot of people sort of hypothesize that has to do with increase in deliveries of goods and services. So 18-year low due to coronavirus, but then sort of now historic highs. Great way to lower demand. So this was right in the start of the pandemic, during a lot of the sort of initial lockdown periods. We can see demand fell by something like 40% over the course of several months, but then rebounded, not as high as before, as I was mentioning, and still to this day is still not quite as high as the 2019 averages. But the rebound has sort of allowed demand to recover.
I just have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think the online shopping and all of that is going to increase the demand further?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, that's what I was saying. So part of the rebound in sort of more recent time, so the period of 2021, that pushed freight to be higher, and a lot of people do think that like things like online shopping and delivery delivery services has led to an increase in freight to be above what it was in 2019. So yeah, I guess all of us who are ordering all of these all this junk off Amazon, we're contributing to that growth.
Has anyone tried to quantify how much of the increase is because of online delivery services?
Yeah. So there's actually a good deal of research at our institute to look at that. So one of the Professor Miguel Yaller, so he actually does a lot of work in this area. So if you want to learn more about last mile deliveries and stuff like that, talk to Professor Yaller.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
Just to, can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just to give a little more to respond to Raina's question about the information he was asking for. So in that paper that you are mentioning, Alan, it's 13%. So from like 2 years ago period, how much was e-commerce affecting deliveries? And so the impact was reduced actually by 13%. Like in the BMT, so they were doing calculations over BMT.
Okay.
Comparing, let's suppose someone going to an in-place store, like a physical store, and instead of buying online, so it was a reduction of 13%. So it's actually positive.
Wait,
There's a really nice paper about that available.
sorry, you're saying that online growth has gone up or down?
The amount of BMT have been going down.
Oh,
When you compare like people traveling with purpose of buying stuff in a store,
yeah.
rather than buying online, or in comparison with buying online.
Yeah, so that's an indication that buying online has increased relative to buying in person, right?
Yeah, it has increased, but then the number of, like the amount of BMT have been going down.
Yep, yep. And so that's because, you know, if you think about like the number of miles that I would have to travel, like a bunch of people would have to travel to go shopping compared to if you were delivering it, right? It's more efficient to do the delivery, at least in terms of miles traveled.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And so secondly, emissions, but it's more tricky to measure the emissions.
Yeah, because you have to figure out the counterfactuals. It's
Yeah.
a difficult problem, which is why we have smart researchers working on it.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Oops, sorry. I'm clicking around here. Okay, so thinking about processing. So the way this works, right, is that you have to go from your petroleum, your crude oil, and you have to refine it into the sort of ultimate end use fuels of interest. So we'll talk about that in a second, but your oil will go into a refinery, get refined to storage. And so you can either have that as imported oil or domestic oil. You can also have sort of already refined fuels getting imported. And so all of this goes to storage. You go to, then it gets transported from the refinery to fuel terminals. These are bulk storage terminals. There's about 30 in California. There's a couple hundred across the entire US. And these things sort of just hold large reservoirs of your end use fuels, and they get transported either via pipeline or through, you know, barge, ship, rail, or truck to your fuel terminals. And these are the from the bulk storage terminals. This is the point at which right before it goes essentially to the gas station, which is where most people sort of are used to experiencing these things. We also have blending of gasoline with ethanol. So in California, for example, all gasoline is required to be at least 15% blended ethanol. And so that comes in from production of ethanol transported to the fuel terminal as well. Okay, so petroleum or crude oil is on average composed of, you know, these compounds, carbon compounds, so alkanes, naphthalene, aromatics. And we take this crude oil and we refine it into several sorts of outputs depending on sort of the composition of the starting crude oil. So pentane to octane, so carbon chains that are 5 to 8 carbon long, you get gasoline. And so the average barrel of oil is going to yield about 20 gallons of gasoline. And of course, this is going to vary depending on the sort of composition of your starting crude oil. And just as a note, right? So a barrel, the volume for a barrel is 42 gallons. So just about half of that will be gasoline. Longer carbon chains. So this is going to be sort of little thicker and more viscous. This is going to be C9 up to about C16, and that's going to give you diesel, kerosene, and jet fuel. The properties of these types of fuels, right, are slightly different from gasoline. They're actually more energy dense. And so that's why you actually use these types of fuels in certain types of applications. And then as you get to longer and longer chains of carbon, right, you're starting to transition actually more to sort of solids types of oils. And so this is fuel oil, lubricating oil. When you're up to around C25, you're starting to get into kind of waxy-like materials, and then greater than C35, you're talking about, right on the, you're talking really about solids. So greater than C35 is resulting in things like asphalt. Gasoline itself is not a homogeneous mixture. It is, it's a heterogeneous mixture of small hydrocarbons. This is the wrong word that you see here. Heterogeneous mixture of small hydrocarbons, so anywhere between, well, 4 is going to be sort of really on the smaller end. Usually you're going to be around 6 to 8, but it can get sort of the range of 4 to 12 is going to exist in there, but the sort of really small ones and larger carbon chains are going to be a lot rarer. Gasoline is about 45 megajoules per kilogram in terms of energy density. As we were talking about before, reserves of oil is around 1.6 trillion barrels. So that's, about a little less than half of that in terms of gasoline. And note that we consume about 4 times 10 to the 11. So that's what, 400 billion gallons of gasoline per year. It's a very sort of astoundingly large volume. Okay. Okay, thinking about thermodynamic cycles for petroleum, for gasoline. So this is an example of an Otto cycle. It goes through these sort of phases. So this is in contrast to some of the other ones that we were talking about before, with the Rankine cycle and the Brayton cycle. Note that like real world engines don't follow exactly this procedure. It's actually can be fairly a little bit more sort of complex, but this is a sort of idealized representation of a typical like piston engine. The efficiency of these things in theory can reach as high as sort of 60%, but in reality, your average efficiency is going to be substantially lower. Okay, so let's talk about how a car engine works. So this is a diagram of a typical sort of piston. So hopefully everyone can kind of see this animation. So this is comprised of 4 stages, hence the sort of 4-stroke cycle, in case anyone has ever heard of that term. So in the very first stage, this is known as the intake stage, and you can see what's happening is the piston is sort of depressing downwards. And what is happening simultaneously as the piston sort of comes down is that the intake port will open up, and that allows for air to get sucked into the piston. At the same time that that's happening, you can also see there is sort of this device over here. This is known as the fuel injector, and it will essentially aspirate your gasoline into the piston. And so you need a mixture, right, of both fuel and air for combustion to happen. In the second stage, both of the valves will close for the fuel intake and for the fuel injector, and the piston is going to move up and compress it. And so this allows, by compressing the fuel air mixture together, you're going to allow for a better, a more efficient combustion to occur. The third stage is where you're actually extracting sort of work energy. And so what happens is you've got this spark plug right here. And what that does is it will ignite that air mixture. And so you basically have an explosion happening inside of this piston. And that explosion is what's going to sort of push down your piston and thus cause this whole sort of assembly at the bottom to rotate. And in the final stroke, your piston is going to come back up. And in this phase, it is going to open a different valve going to the exhaust port. And as that happens, it will suck out all of the combustion byproducts that happened in your power stroke. Okay. So now we can see kind of the full schematic of the engine. And you can see this is a sort of 4-cylinder engine. And what you can see at the bottom is that the movement of the pistons are rotating these cams, which essentially moves this crankshaft. And the rotation of the crankshaft is sort of what's aligning the timing of everything that's happening. Okay, and so this is actually sort of a physical timer. You can see that it is connected to this timing belt chain, and up top is another shaft that's getting rotated. This is known as the camshaft, and it moves these cams to essentially open and close all of the valves that I was talking about at exactly the right times. And so there's like a physical connection to ensure that everything is operating correctly. You may have heard of like a V8 or a V10 or a V12 engine, and that actually just refers, it actually refers to both the shape of the sort of orientation of your pistons and the number of pistons. So you can imagine what happens as you add sort of more and more pistons. The way that I like to kind of describe this is, imagine the difference between pedaling on a bike that has like 1 pedal versus 2 pedals, right? You'd have to like push down with, if you only had 1 pedal on your bike, you would have to push down really hard with 1 foot and allow that sort of momentum to carry your pedal back up to the top, and then you'd push down really hard again. And you can imagine that that process is a little bit more like jerky, right? And so as you add the second pedal, it kind of smooths it out because now you can alternate how hard you're sort of pushing down. And so the basic idea here is that as you add more and more pistons, then that sort of like a pedaling process on your bike, analogously, it will make it smoother.
Alan, I think another important part is the balance, right? That's why you don't see engines typically have odd numbered numbers of cylinders.
Yeah.
Because typically one of the cylinders is used to balance out, especially in the V configuration. Inline engines, it's not as much of an issue, but that's why you have V6, V8, etc., not V5 or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. If you had an odd number of pistons, I guess, I mean, theoretically you could do it, but your configuration would probably be a little bit different. But yeah, it will sort of balance the forces that you're exerting on the crankshaft. Okay, so these days we use these fuel injectors that spray gas into the cylinder at like exactly the right moments. If you've got a really old car, you might still have a carburetor, which is kind of like a physical like dripping mechanism that was used to introduce fuel into your cylinders. That's kind of a bygone technology now. And then when I'm sure everyone has seen this, when you go to the gas station, you see these sort of fuel octane ratings. So this rating refers to actually the sort of chemical composition of the gasoline that you're putting in. And the idea here is that higher octane ratings tend to resist something known as auto ignition. And so what happens is if we remember back to that piston diagram, if you actually, let me just go back to it really quick. So one of the things that can happen is that you can imagine you're like blowing up gasoline inside of this piston all the time. So the temperature of this thing is actually fairly high. And so in stage 2, during the compression stroke, as it moves up and pressurizes the fuel air mixture, if the temperature is high enough, it can undergo this thing called auto ignition, which will combust the fuel air mixture before the power stroke. And so now you're operating this thing not sort of in sync with what you want. And that process is actually known as knocking. This really only occurs with fairly high performance cars where the engine will reach temperatures that and also will have the ability to compress the fuel air mixture to the state where auto ignition happens. So really only certain types of cars should be using sort of higher octane gasoline fuel. And if you're filling up like a Honda Civic or something with sort of premium fuels, it's kind of just a waste of money. So remember that combustion requires oxygen. And so imagine sort of the volume of fuel that you're combusting and the sort of corresponding amount of oxygen that would be required, right? For every sort of carbon atom, you are essentially requiring sort of two or single molecule of oxygen gas to sort of properly combust. So the ratio of gas to oxygen an engine needs is about 1 to 14. So each part of gasoline requires 14 parts oxygen, which means that for a typical vehicle that has a 20-gallon tank, your engine will take in 20,000 cubic feet of oxygen. So it's quite a lot. And then you can think about analogously, that also means everything's coming out as sort of carbon dioxide, right? And so quite a large volume of carbon dioxide sort of being emitted. There is oil that's required for lubrication. So that's just making sure that everything is going to be properly lubricated. If you don't have oil, you can degrade the engine and overheat it. Cooling is an important process. That's why you have engine coolant. This is coming from your radiator that helps to maintain the temperature of the engine, the critical components, and this is both at sort of high temperatures and low temperatures. And so there's a whole series of sort of cooling devices to make sure that your engine doesn't get too hot when it's operating. And then you've got the electrical components of the vehicle. So the battery is going to supply power for a lot of the electrical systems. And you have an alternator that's essentially working like a generator. So this allows you to convert mechanical energy from the operation of the engine into electricity that can power this battery. But the battery itself is also going to, for example, distribute electricity to power the spark plugs in the correct timing order. And these are the things, the electrical spark plugs nowadays. These are the things that are used to ignite the fuel air mixture. And lastly, you've got your exhaust assembly. And so we are required to, in the United States, and actually more strictly in California, you have to filter the exhaust. We'll actually talk a little bit about the sort of policies behind this later on in this class, but essentially all of the exhaust is collected and it has to go through a catalytic converter, which helps to reduce the sort of toxic elements coming out of your exhaust. And then you have a muffler to reduce all of this engine noise. Okay, and then the crankshaft that was moving, that was rotating as a result of the pistons sort of moving up and down, that's rotating at a sort of extremely high speed. Okay, and so your wheels do not rotate at the same speed as your crankshaft. That would be way too fast. And so the rotational movements of your crankshaft is translated through a series of gears. It's a very sort of complex process. You could take entire classes about just learning about transmissions. So that rotation is translated through your transmission into your drive shaft, which ultimately kind of spin your wheels. Okay, and so why am I sort of getting into all this detail about the sort of operational aspects of your gas car? Oh, I think it's somewhat interesting to know about since so many people rely on, but also to serve as a contrast for how newer alternative fuel vehicles work. So thinking about electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles, and hopefully you can see that, if you've seen electric vehicles sort of out on the road, they, look like your average car, right? But what's under the hood is sort of vastly, sort of completely different than sort of the world of internal combustion. So let's think about non-fossil fuels. So the first one, so firstly, we'll talk about your sort of traditional electric vehicle. So if you recall that in a gas car, we tend to have these batteries that power the electrical components, and that sort of large battery that you have sitting under the hood is typically a lead acid battery. So that is this sort of large, bulky battery. And does anyone actually know what car this is over here?
The EV1.
Oh, yeah, the EV one.
Yep. So this is the EV1. So this was kind of the first modern day, I'm going to say, quote unquote, commercial vehicle. So this was produced by General Motors back in the mid 90s, sort of following California Air Resources Board's push for electrification starting in the early 90s. And the first iteration of these vehicles actually used just these large lead acid batteries sort of strung together. So these vehicles had just tons of these lead acid batteries, which are really heavy, really dense. They don't have great energy and power density, so you would need a lot of them to be able to sort of power the car. And even then, the range is very, very small, especially thinking about relative to sort of modern day electric vehicles. Yeah, Tom Hanks had one. That's right. And actually, we have these old EV boxes over here at our institute, and he actually had one of the original EV boxes as well. He's a big EV enthusiast for sure. The sort of next evolution in battery technology is known as nickel metal hydride. And so when we think about the Toyota Prius and hybrid vehicles for sort of a long period of time following Priuses, I would say for the next decade and a half, use these batteries. So these aren't these nickel metal hydride batteries are not they're better in terms of power and energy density, but still kind of not enough to really solely power the drivetrain of a vehicle, at least not for sort of long distances. But they're great at allowing for a lot of the hybrid vehicle technology to flourish. And lastly, lithium ion batteries, sort of the commonplace battery for modern day electric vehicles, much higher energy and power density, and so therefore allowing for explicit sort of powering of your vehicle's drivetrain. So how do batteries work? So this is the important thing to remember is that batteries are a form of energy storage. They don't actually produce energy themselves. You have to put in energy to get energy out. Essentially, you have an anode, cathode, and electrolytes, and it uses essentially the potential energy difference in the concentration of positive versus negative in your anode versus cathode to allow for production of electricity as you allow electrons to move through your circuit. And so your lithium ions essentially are, which you can see kind of moving back and forth in your electrolyte. This movement is what allows sort of electricity to flow. So think about how energy dense we talked about gasoline was. You're talking about 45 megajoules per kilogram. And so in order to compete against that, this sort of new form of energy use has to hit this sweet spot in terms of the size of the batteries and the weight of batteries, which is one of the sort of large issues that we had in sort of earlier generations of electric vehicles. And actually, I mean, it's still an ongoing issue, especially as we think about trying to electrify heavier and heavier vehicles. Energy density and power. What I'll quickly mention here is that, actually, let me see, do I have that slide? So the energy density and the power density of a battery is related, and usually you have to make some sort of trade-off. So if you want really high energy density, that usually comes somewhat at the expense of power density, and same converse, if you want high power density, then you may have sort of lower energy density. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that if you think about the amount of energy within a battery is related to the energy density. And so if I want to have a really long range, for example, you could kind of tune characteristics of the battery to have higher energy density and sacrifice a little bit in power. And conversely, if I want the battery to produce enough power to, say, move a heavier vehicle, then you could have, you could tune up the power density somewhat at the expense of energy density in order to, say, move like a heavier truck, but then you would have to sacrifice in terms of range. And so this is one of the sort of fundamental difficulties that electrification has in moving to sort of larger and larger vehicle classes. Obviously, there are sort of universal improvements in the technology that will help alleviate some of these issues. And so we have seen that occur sort of progressively over the last decade in terms of size, weight, and both energy and power density, where everything is kind of improving. But you still fundamentally have some of these trade-off issues, which is why right today there are fewer options for larger vehicle classes compared to smaller vehicle classes. But again, these things are improving over time, and we are starting to see more and more sort of larger vehicle classes improving.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So do you know the aviation industry? Like, I think they are also trying to hybridize their vehicle system so that airplane can also depend on electric and also gasoline. So is that mostly battery based, or do you know?
So okay, yeah. So broadly speaking, when we think about moving this idea of improving sustainability and improving environmental footprint of transportation modes. So in the passenger vehicle side of things, right, we see a lot of electrification and a little movement towards fuel cells, although not as much. In heavier duty, you're starting to talk about more serious difficulties in electrification, right? Because the amount of battery that you would need to put in is much larger. And so there are people who are trying to do that, but there's also a big push to look at things like hydrogen and alternative fuels. And so when we think about that sort of trend, moving to aviation, it's actually much more difficult to do electrification. And in fact, I am not really aware of any sort of hard push to electrify aviation to a sort of large extent. There's definitely, you know, projects and sort of lab research looking at these things, but my impression is that in aviation, a lot of it is looking at synthetic fuels. Even doing something like hydrogen for airplanes is difficult because the energy density of hydrogen is really quite low. And so we're thinking more about some kind of biofuel-based fuel that can be used in aviation to make it sustainable. I don't think there's much talk about electrifying that sector.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we take a quick break? It's 11:04. We'll do 5 minutes and reconvene at 11:09. Yeah, then I'll be here if anyone has any questions in the meantime.
Just a general housekeeping question, Alan. I have not been able to see any of the lecture recordings on Canvas.
Oh, so they're posted on the pages. Let me see. Let me pull it up and make sure that that other folks can access it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me show you where it is, and then you guys can confirm whether it's actually there. So I've been posting them in pages under lecture recordings. I'm not sure if people can access it, but maybe if you can take a quick
I'll
look.
look right now.
Yeah, and I have it as like an embedded thing in the Kaltura, I think it's what it's called, but I also have it as a YouTube video posting.
Oh, I do see it. I just missed it.
Okay, no problem. Okay,
Thank
as
you.
long as you're able to access it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I post these like right after, and then it takes like 10-15 minutes to upload, but you should be able to access it as soon as it's done uploading.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's continue onwards. Thinking about lithium battery economics. So this is a pretty famous paper that came out in 2014. It was published in Nature Climate Change or Nature Communications, one of those two. And essentially what the authors of this paper did was they went around and asked a bunch of experts and a bunch of industry experts. So you can see they talked to like Nissan and Tesla and sort of looked at other research journals. And basically they did this compilation of elicitations to understand where the price or like the cost for batteries was per kilowatt hour sort of in the past. And so you can see kind of this broad range of costs. And they also tried to elicit future costs from these experts, both researchers and industry leaders. So you can see that in these triangles to see kind of where we expect these costs to be in sort of the future. You can see that at the bottom of this plot, there's this sort of red shaded area, and that starts at $150 per kilowatt hour. And so if you were kind of embroiled in the world of EV research at the time, you know, this $150 per kilowatt hour, sort of at the battery pack level, is the sort of magic number for what battery costs would need to be in order for electric vehicles to essentially break even with a gas car vehicle. And so this isn't sort of right at the purchase price. This is like over the lifetime of an electric vehicle, because electricity is cheaper than gasoline. You know, if you were at $150, that's roughly when you would say that we would sort of break even. So the interesting thing is, if you look at all of these projections, like no one actually really said that we would reach $150 per kilowatt hour. Maybe, you know, one or two people said by 2025 or 2030, you might get to $150. So the nice thing is everyone got it wrong. Okay, so the costs have gone down to well below $150 much more rapidly than anyone expected. You know, so we're in, you know, 2022 right now, but probably it reached there 2018, 2019 time period. So no one actually even really talks about 150 anymore. The sort of new hot number is $85 per kilowatt hour. And that's the point at which most people would argue that an electric car would be break even with a gas car at the point of purchase. So not even thinking about the savings long term that you would get, but right at the dealership, you would expect the prices for vehicles to be about the same between a gas and electric car. And so we are sort of onwards to that kind of number, and I'm not going to make the same mistake and pretend to know when that will happen, but we will see in the future. And I think the sort of general takeaway is that even among all the experts in this area, like nobody really got it right. Came down a lot faster than anyone had anticipated. So this is a sense to provide some sense of battery production capacities. Note that this figure is actually quite old now for these sort of standards, but I haven't been able to, unfortunately, find like a better sort of update, but this gives you some sense of the volumes we were talking about back in 2014. And you can you can be sure that all of these bars have definitely sort of moved upwards. A lot of productions of gigafactories and that sort of thing. Okay, so thinking about all of the sort of parts of your gasoline engine, in contrast to that, electric vehicles are way simpler. Okay, basically you've got instead of your engine, right, which is comprised of all these different moving parts. You've got your piston, your crankshaft, your timing belt, your camshaft, the cams, going into your sort of large scale transmission system and your drive shaft. You can think of all the sort of moving parts there. In electric vehicle, you basically got your motor and your drive shaft, and that's pretty much it. Okay, those are your only sort of moving parts in the vehicle. There's a much sort of larger battery pack to provide electricity for your motor. And you do have kind of a built-in transmission system in the motor, but it's going to be fairly different from your sort of traditional transmission system. You don't really have like a gearing. You don't have to shift in gearing in order to power your electric vehicle. There are some electronics controller. You need a converter and an inverter for charging purposes. If you are charging at lower power levels, that's AC power, and the battery has to be powered by the AC, or sorry, the battery is DC, so it needs the AC to be converted to DC, and all electric motors are for electric vehicles are AC power, and so you need the converters to go between these forms of currents both ways. So probably the most complex is the plug-in hybrid, which combines both gasoline components and the traditional gasoline components and the sort of new age electric vehicle. So the way that a plug-in hybrid works is it has both a battery and an engine. It will primarily, most plug-in hybrids will primarily power the drivetrain through electricity until the battery is somewhat depleted, and then you're able to turn on the engine and operate it as like a normal gas car or a normal sort of hybrid vehicle. And so as a result, these types of vehicles require components of both the gas car and the electric car. So you've got your engine, and you have both a battery pack as well as a fuel tank. And then you've got your transmission system. You also have your motor that's powering from the electricity side, right? And then you have to both charge the vehicle and fuel the vehicle with gasoline. And the sort of benefit of these types of vehicles is that it allows you to work around issues related to range. So if you and refueling. So, hypothetically, if I wanted to drive from NorCal to SoCal, if I were doing it in an electric vehicle, I would have to stop at some point and charge up the vehicle, which ostensibly takes longer to refuel. Whereas with this type of vehicle, you could do sort of local driving on electricity and then long trips using your gasoline engine. So just as an example of why some consumers, think to this technology. So electric vehicle ranges. So this is the range in terms of miles. We have a sort of pretty wide variety of ranges. So this this chart is again a little bit older, but even even say 5-6 years ago, you're talking about ranges that go anywhere from 60 miles all the way up to above 300. Nowadays, actually, the longest range vehicle is the Lucid Air, which is over 500 miles of all electric range. The trends in range and battery sizes have typically trended upwards. And so you can see here sort of at the beginning, you know, your earliest instantiation of a Nissan Leaf was at 73 miles with a 24 kilowatt hour battery. But now there is a 40 kilowatt hour version at 150 miles. There's actually a Nissan Leaf Plus, which has a longer range than that. I think it's a 60 kilowatt hour. So it's something at like 230 miles of range. And you can see, you know, all of the ranges for the sort of earliest generation of vehicles has now been sort of really surpassed when we're looking at some of the more popular vehicle models, the Teslas, the Mustang Mach-E, which are sort of in the hundreds of mile ranges. Any questions about these electric vehicles so far? Okay, so going back to plug-in hybrids, I was talking about the sort of operational aspects of this. There are actually several different setups. They're actually fairly complex in the way that you can sort of arrange these configurations, but generally you've got three types of things: series, parallel, and series parallel plug-in hybrids. And okay, let's look at how these operate. So in a purely series plug-in hybrid, you have your battery connected to your motor that operates the drivetrain. Okay, great. So then in electric mode, you have sort of your regular setup. And then when you turn on the engine, in this case, the engine is not connected directly to the drivetrain. Okay, so unlike a gas car, which would mechanically rotate your drive shaft through a series of connections to your engine, right? This powers a generator, which will power the battery. And the motor will only operate through the battery. So the engine can never cause the wheels to spin. Essentially, it can only power the battery. That's in contrast to a parallel setup where you have the engine connected to the drivetrain directly and the battery connected to the drivetrain via the motor. So both of those will sort of independently power your drivetrain. And then you can have both of these in a series parallel, which is, I would say, the more common configuration of modern day plug-in hybrids. An example of this would be like the now sort of discontinued Chevy Bolt, but essentially you have an engine powering a generator, which can move both the which can translate through a transmission to sort of power the motor, but it can also provide electricity to charge the battery. So these setups will essentially allow your plug-in hybrid to operate in sort of fairly different ways. Oh, okay. I see a question popping up here. Why don't we have electric motorcycles yet? So there are actually some electric motorcycles, and actually, they're I think that they're maybe proportionally less popular than your traditional gasoline or combustion based motorcycles, and that may have to do with kind of like the culture of people who ride motorcycles, who want an engine. But there is definitely movement on that front as well. Like I know that Harley Davidson has a whole sort of new lineup of all electric motorcycles. And there's another company. Oh yeah, actually, energetic or Energic. Yeah, that is. It's like there are a couple electric motorcycle startups that have gained a lot of traction. Yeah, so in terms of popularity, electric bikes are definitely like bicycles are definitely have taken off quite a bit. Or so thinking about like e-bikes over the last couple of years, but there are definitely existing electric motorcycles. I guess you just don't hear about them as much in the news. Yeah, so refueling. So this is a sort of common topic in people thinking about electric vehicles. So, with a gas station, right, I can, the argument is typically like, oh, I can fill up my car in a matter of minutes, right? It's much faster than charging the electric vehicle. And so that is true, but it also sort of discounts this sort of really different sort of world of the way people employ charging. And so if we think about a gas vehicle, like the typical pattern, right, is that I drive my vehicle until it's close to empty on gasoline, and then I go to the gas station and refill. So the thing with electric vehicles is, okay, I actually have the availability of charging my car in a whole multitude of places. I can do it at home, I can charge at work. Actually, I have an electric car that's charging for free at work right now, which is a pretty big perk of having sort of like free workplace charging, public charging, lots of different places that you can charge at, like grocery stores or when you're going out to eat, right? And so there's like inherent convenience built into aligning the refueling of your vehicle with the destination that you actually want to or need to be going to, right? And so if you actually ask a bunch of people, like, oh, how much do you actually enjoy going to a gas station? I've actually never heard of someone who really likes traveling to gas stations to refill their car. So there are a whole lot of sort of different benefits that get discounted when thinking about electric vehicle charging. Charging connectors. These are different ways that you can recharge your vehicle. And so if you are an owner of an electric vehicle, a lot of the stuff is familiar, but this is going to be a little bit different for folks who are used to just kind of filling up your gas tank with a gas car. So level 1 and level 2 charging. So this is follows a standard protocol known as J1772. So all electric vehicles have the ability to use this type of charging connector. Level 1 and level 2 both use AC power. And so this is the power that's going to come directly out of your typical sockets. So level 1 is your ordinary sort of 110 volt plug, and it can charge at a rate of about 1 kilowatt. And so that's on the order of about 5 to 6 miles of range in 1 hour of charging. And that depends on the efficiency of your vehicle, but you can imagine, like, if you were at home and you just sort of plug in overnight, you're going to get on the order of anywhere between 40 to say 70 miles of range. And note that, right, in the US, the average amount someone drives in a day is actually somewhere around 30 miles. So even level 1, though it's slow, you know, if your car is just sitting at home the whole time, not such a big deal. Level 2 also uses a J1772 connecting standard. So these, you can think of like the larger sort of drier plugs. The voltage is a little bit higher. This goes up to, in theory, rated up to 20 kilowatts, but the vast majority of level 2 chargers are typically 6 to 7 kilowatts. And so you are now talking about doing, you know, 25 to 30 miles of charging in 1 hour. And then lastly, we have DC fast charging. So this uses direct current, not alternating current. And you can see there are sort of 3 major standards for DC charging, DC fast charging. There's CHAdeMO, which is used by some Asian manufacturers, so Nissan and Kia, actually specifically more popular in Japan. There is CCS, which is the combined, it's kind of referred to as the combo standard. You can see the head here is for the J1772 is identical, and then it has sort of larger pin connectors at the bottom for the positive and negative electrodes. And then Tesla has their own sort of standard HPWC. These are what you would find at your Tesla superchargers. Traditionally, there have been requirements to build both CCS and CHAdeMO at a lot of public chargers in California to ensure that everyone has access. And I would have said that these standards are sort of fairly equal in the past, but I think that now CCS is kind of winning the standard war. And what that means is that some like Nissan and Kia, some of the automakers have decided to start producing CCS connections in their vehicles. And actually Tesla has adapters that allow these to be charged at CCS, and also there is a movement to retrofit and for new connections at Tesla superchargers to provide CCS charging. So I probably wouldn't have said this like 2, maybe even a year ago, but sort of recent movement in this area seems to be sort of aligning the standards into CCS. And so I think this is going to be the most popular thing that we see going into the future. So your typical DC fast charging, I would say in the last decade would be about 50 kilowatts. Okay, and so you can kind of translate what that means in terms of miles per hour. I can usually get like 80% of my 150 mile Nissan Leaf in a little less than an hour at 50 kilowatts. But those power ratings have been sort of creeping upwards. I think now it's not uncommon to find 100 kilowatt DC fast chargers for both CHAdeMO and CCS. And for Teslas, their superchargers tend to be at 120 kilowatts, although again, that also has been creeping upwards. You can find superchargers that are sort of closer to 150 and even in some cases as high as 200 kilowatts. These devices are rated depending on which standard, but can go as high in theory as 400 kilowatts. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But this is 50 to 120 kilowatts. You're talking about on the order of 150 to 300 miles of charging in an hour. There are a whole buttload of providers. Maybe you guys have seen some of these around, probably some of the more popular ones, ChargePoint here, EVgo for fast charging, Electrify America is really, really quite large these days. And of course, Tesla, but there's all of these sort of different charging providers. It's actually quite annoying. On my phone, I probably have a dozen or so apps that I have to have so that if I go to charge my vehicle at any particular one, I have the sort of access ready. Really sort of popular, one country that's really popular with electric vehicles, Norway. They actually did this thing where they integrated all of the providers into like a single key fob that can be universally accessed any charger. It'd be nice to have something like that in the US, but nothing like that exists so far. There are a whole lot of electric vehicle chargers. California definitely leads the country in terms of charging. And within California, there's actually on the order, I think now around 80,000 electric vehicle chargers. And that's in contrast to, maybe around 2,000 plus gasoline stations. And so in terms of availability, there's a lot more than people think. We probably still have some ways to go to sort of keep up with the necessary demand, but they're around if you look for them.
Alan,
yeah.
So these numbers include the chargers for heavy duty trucks?
Yes.
And do you know the numbers, the shares between?
Oh, heavy duty trucking is going to be like nothing right now. Yeah, and then the types of chargers that you need for heavy duty trucks is like very sort of different. Yeah, so those are still in development, I would say.
So I guess that is happening is mainly heavy duty trucks. Owners, they have to build their own station, right?
No, not necessarily. That is one business model. So you're talking about like a centralized hub where heavy duty freight can provide their services and come back home for recharging. So that is one business model, but then there are lots of other, there's a movement to, develop charging hubs on major arteries so that, it's in a similar way. We have that now for diesel provisions where you have these large fueling hubs where lots of trucks can come and stop to refuel. And there's discussions of developing the same sort of hubs for charging as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yep.
Do you know how much does it cost to install a charging port?
Yeah.
Maybe
yeah.
level 2?
Yes. So I should put together a slide on that. But The costs are different between level 1, level 2, and DC fast. There's been a lot of work looking at this. Level 1, obviously this will kind of depend what's already in place and accessibility and sort of existing electrical infrastructure and how you want to like put the infrastructure in relative to location of like a local sort of transformer and that sort of thing. But the range for level 1 is going to be, you know, at home anywhere between like a couple $100. Oh, sorry, for level 2. Level 2 at home anywhere between a couple $100 up to maybe a couple $1,000. Especially if you have to upgrade your panel. I think the average is probably around $1,000. For a public site, it might be as high as $10,000 if you have to do things like trenching and extension of electrical cabling and that sort of thing. For DC fast chargers, you're talking about anywhere between, say, $50,000 up to $1 million plus. We actually know of specific examples in California where it has costed this high, especially if you don't have the electrical infrastructure providing electricity to that area. But you're usually talking about on the order of like 150K up to 200K for DC fast charging.
Got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I also had a question about the like around 80,000 chargers that are in California. Is that including ones that people have installed at home, or is it all public?
No, just public chargers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. For home charging, it's going to be way higher, right? So in California, we have anywhere between, I haven't checked the numbers recently, like 800,000 to 1 million electric vehicles. So not all of them will have home charging, right? But I would say a fairly substantial number will have some access to home charging, either level 1 or level 2. And so you're talking on the order of hundreds of thousands of chargers at home. And I should mention that in terms of like charging ratios, about 80%, 85% of charging events are home charging, and then the remainder is sort of divided between workplace charging and public charging. So most of the charging is going to be happening at home.
Yeah, just one more question. When you say home charges, does that include portable charges as well?
Yep. So that's like wall chargers where I could just plug into a 110 volts and plug it directly into my car. Yeah, and maybe I'll make a quick plug for another class that it's a new class that I'll be teaching next quarter called Introduction to Electric Vehicles, where we go into all this stuff in way more detail. So if you're interested in learning about all sorts of aspects about electric cars, yeah, you can look into that. I'm happy to provide a syllabus for anyone who's interested. Okay, so the last thing that I'll mention about the chargers is these 350 plus kilowatt chargers. We'll kind of refer to these as extreme fast chargers. And the whole point of this type of charger is to try and replicate the gas station model. At 350 kilowatts, you're talking about sort of fully charging a 300-mile vehicle within say 10 minutes, right? And so there are actually already some examples of these stations being deployed. There's one in the Bay Area, for example, and this can charge your vehicle at extremely high speeds. the power is extremely high. The cables actually need to be sort of liquid cooled to maintain the temperatures. This is definitely not something you'd want to like subject your vehicle to every day, because actually it will accelerate the degradation of your battery a little bit. And so this is potentially an area in the future where we would see these kind of taking the role of a traditional gas station. Right now, I will note though that there is no existing vehicle model that has the capability of being charged at this high of a power. So keep that in mind. There in the future, I'm sure there will be, but I think right now the highest power that a EV can handle, I think, is the Porsche Taycan, which can charge, I believe, at 250 kilowatts. But that's kind of as high as you can get realistically right now. Actually, the Rivians that just came out may also be at a higher power rate. I have to look into that, but I don't know for sure. I know that they're originally designed to do higher power. I don't think that they're doing 350 kilowatts, but they may be close to the Porsche as well. Okay, so let's talk about a different type of electric car, and that's for hydrogen. So hydrogen is a sort of similar technology that employs hydrogen fuel in order to produce electricity. So the fueling aspect of it, the fuel aspect of it in terms of production, you can see over here, proportionally, the vast majority of production is actually coming through fossil fuels. And that occurs through a process known as, predominantly through a process known as steam reformation. So this is where you take methane combined with water, and it produces carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and you can sort of recycle this carbon monoxide to produce slightly more hydrogen. And so you'll notice here that for every sort of 4 molecules of hydrogen, you're still generating CO2. So this process of steam reformation is still environmentally unsustainable in the sense that it produces greenhouse gases. So this form of hydrogen production would not be considered, I would say, necessarily green. There's also hydrogen electrolysis, where you take water and you split it into hydrogen and oxygen. But this process is fairly inefficient and takes a lot of energy to do. So once you have the hydrogen gas, you're actually, the way that you extract energy out of it is the exact opposite of the electrolysis reaction, where you combine hydrogen and oxygen to produce water. This is an exothermic reaction, so it produces energy, and this is taken advantage of in a fuel cell. So the amount of energy that you're producing is about 572 kilojoules sort of per kilogram of hydrogen, and it's facilitated in a fuel cell by this process here. So you have an anode and a cathode and electrolyte, so this looks pretty similar to a battery. the fuel cells typically contain what's known as this proton exchange membrane. And this usually is some kind of a like platinum-based catalyst that allows for this process to happen at a sort of lower initial threshold energy in order to get the reaction going. And by transferring the protons, it allows for a flow of electrons through your circuit and produces electricity. In practice, so the sort of most common commercial vehicle is the Toyota Mirai. This gets about 300 miles with a 5-kilogram hydrogen tank. Unfortunately, hydrogen is still pretty expensive these days. It costs about $16 for a kilogram. And that means that it's actually quite a bit more expensive than gasoline. And in fact, if you were to go out and lease a Toyota Mirai, Toyota will hand you a $15,000 credit card that gives you free fueling over the term of your lease. It's one of the sort of ways that they can get people to purchase, or not purchase, but to lease these vehicles, which helps them with meeting some regulatory requirements. Layout of the hydrogen fuel vehicle. It's very similar to a battery electric vehicle. And in fact, it does itself have a small battery pack. But the main way that it's powered is through a fuel cell stack, which takes your hydrogen from your fuel tank to produce electricity. And then the rest of the components look pretty much identical to an electric vehicle. You do still need your electronics controller and a converter in order to get the sort of right form of electricity, because coming out of the fuel cell is going to be DC power. Okay. So we'll end the day looking at some electricity impacts or environmental impacts of our various transportation modes. So the sort of obvious ones for fossil fuels, and we've talked about this a bit already. So drilling and producing the oil has a variety of sort of localized environmental impacts in your ecosystem, so disturbing both the land and marine ecosystems. And there are a whole lot of improvements in the way that these are happening now to try and minimize some of these impacts. So efficiencies of exploration and drilling activities, so satellites, GPS, remote sensing, and seismic technologies to reduce kind of the footprints and exploration of looking for your fuels. Some of the environmental concerns with hydraulic fracking. So we had talked about this a little bit. Uses a very large amount of water in order to release the oils and gases. And a lot of the wells, if they are faulty in the way that they are constructed or handled, can result in leaks and spills of some of these fluids, which is particularly dangerous if these things leak into like local watersheds. So you can have wastewater that contain dissolved chemicals and contaminants, which you can no longer reuse and need to be sort of properly disposed of. This is like a real life example where you have sort of leakage into a watershed that actually ends up putting enough hydrocarbons into your water to make it flammable. probably not something you want to be drinking. Oil spills. So this is usually accidents at the well or with the transportation aspect of it, and pipeline, ships, and trains. As you move oil from your sort of mining points to refineries. Lots of big issues with this, obviously. When we look at some of the historic oil spills, we can see kind of how these compare. Yeah, so if you guys recall, a little over a decade ago, there was a huge accident in the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf. If you watch the news at the time, you could see over the period of 3 or 4 months where you could see oil just kind of continuously getting leaked into the Gulf from their sort of drilling operations. Actually, I think I have a picture of that. Yeah. So so this is the largest oil spill to ever occur in the US or US waters. So over the course of 5 months, it leaked about 5 million barrels of oil, a sort of stupendously large volume, but so one sort of anchor point that I like to think about this is that, you know, over 5 months, this leaking actually resulted in less amount of oil spillage than the amount that we consume in passenger car driving in a single day. And actually you can see that in this previous ring here. This outer circle is the amount of oil that we consume in a single day. So it is the largest contributor to US greenhouse gas emissions. We can see consumption by fuel type here. Petroleum is 37%. And if we look at the associated carbon dioxide emissions by major fuel type, just under half is coming from petroleum, the vast majority of which is in transportation. What about for electric cars? So what happens when we plug in our car? So it is true that for an electric car, that it has no tailpipe emissions, right? Because using the battery doesn't lead to byproducts like you would with combustion of fossil fuels. However, this electricity is coming from something, right? And so we saw this before. So the question is whether or not when I plug in my car at home or at work, is this electricity being powered by renewable sources such as solar and wind, or is this being powered by, say, a coal plant or a natural gas plant? And so this is a very sort of rich area of research. This is actually where a lot of my work, a lot of the work that I do in research lies. And so this depends primarily on where are you charging and when are you charging. This is an example of what we call a dispatch curve. This is in Los Angeles. This is over the course of a week. This is electricity load, essentially. And so if I am during the day, a lot of people will be waking up and turning on their lights, going to the office, turning on computers, and then at nighttime, you know, people go to sleep. You know, your TVs go off and turn off your AC and heaters and that sort of thing. And so you have a cyclical load pattern that looks like this day to day. And then you can actually see what power plants are providing, you know, that power. So here in Southern California, Edison, you have a bunch of solar during the day, you have some wind power, and then a lot of the base load with natural gas and some hydro. So if I charge my vehicle, during the day, you might be mainly using solar, but then if you're charging sort of at night, that accumulation of power could be coming from a combination more of higher proportion of natural gas, for example. And in terms of like the best time to charge, this could be really different depending on if you're like in New York, where you'd want to be charging to minimize emissions. You might want to be charging at nighttime in the middle of the night versus if you're in California, you take advantage of solar charging during the day. Last little bit here, thinking about vehicle to grid. So V1G is unidirectional. So this is actually, instead of, there's this idea where you can discharge from your battery back into the grid. Instead, you could do what's known as smart charging, where I could receive some signals where it says, oh, maybe we need a lot of power at a certain time, so please stop charging, or a different type of environmental signal. It says, oh, right now, the grid is primarily on solar energy, so please charge your vehicle now. So this is where you kind of receive some kind of signal that allows you to charge your car at sort of more ideal times, more cheaper times, for example. And then you have bidirectional, where I can do kind of the same thing, where I'm receiving signals where, okay, electricity costs a lot more money right now. So what I'm going to do is actually sell the electricity that's stored in my vehicle back to the grid. And then when electricity is really cheap, I will now start to charge my vehicle. So there's lots of pilots and schemes for these types of programs to test these kinds of programs in the future for broader use. Okay, so I am at time, so let's end here for today. I'll stick around for any questions folks may have. Otherwise, I will see you all next week. And note that I'll have office hours on Monday. So if anyone wants to talk about any of the lecture material or need help with homework, I will be available then.